continue to venture into the dark side of Darwinism in this Part 2 special edition of Genesis Week. Welcome to this week's show. I'm your host, Ian Chuby. This week's episode is part 2 of a special series investigating the dark side of Darwin. We're taking a radical departure from our standard show today, picking up where we left off last week as we've got a lot to cover. I am honored to have 3 guests join me again for our panel discussion. Joseph Yancor is a licensed minister with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, a developmental service worker working with Christian Horizons, and the founder of Enable Faith Ministries in Toronto, a ministry reaching out to those of the disabled community to foster their involvement within the Christian community and in ministry. He joins me via Skype from Toronto. Dr. Jerry Bergman has 9 degrees in everything from biology to psychology. 2 of those degrees are a PhD. He is the author of the book The Dark Side of Darwin and is himself a former atheist, now turned young earth creationist and Christian. He has taught multiple disciplines at the college level and joins me by telephone from Ohio. Paul Gosselin is an independent researcher specializing in ideologies, belief systems, and religion, and holds a master's degree in social anthropology. He is the author of the 2-volume series with the title that I just love, Flight from the Absolute. He joins us via Skype from Quebec City. If you recall, last week we were talking about eugenics, the idea that we can direct our own evolution, a deliberate removal of the less fit from society and the preservation of the more fit. Even today, one subtle form of disguised modern-day eugenics, Joseph, you work with people who have Down syndrome, for example, which provides a classic modern-day example of eugenics. How many expecting couples have had those dreaded test results come back saying that their unborn baby has Down syndrome? And then the doctors pressure them to abort the child. Abortion, eugenics, and evolution are holding each other's hand. And then how many of those couples say no, only to give birth to a perfectly healthy child who did not have Down syndrome even? So what of those who are born with disabilities like Down syndrome? Aren't they just a burden to society? Why is it wrong to remove them from society?
Well, first of all, let's look at the numbers. According to modern medicine, 90% of parents who get that test result, which I think is terrible, will abort their child. And you're right, a lot of them end up being born without any problem. But even those who are born with Down syndrome or autism, the question I would ask them is this really a disability per se? Sure, it means they're different, but we know that I've read articles of people with autism, for example, who were professors. They believe Abraham Lincoln may have had autism. Einstein is believed to have had Asperger's syndrome. In our day and age, they would have been aborted and would not have had nuclear power. Now, some people weren't happy about that, but the fact that he was a genius and he changed the world. Einstein, my favorite quote from Einstein is, everyone's a genius, but ask a fish to climb a tree and it'll think it's stupid. So even recently, I recently posted on my Facebook channel a video of a woman with Down syndrome who is now, I believe, an elementary school teacher, contributor to society. Abraham Lincoln, if it was true that he had autism, in our system today, he never would have became president. And the slaves would still be slaves. They would never have had the Revolutionary War. Maybe they would have, I don't know. But it goes to show you how much potential a person with autism or Down syndrome could have on society if given the opportunity to grow and develop. And that's part of what I'm doing with Enable is I honestly believe you could either be an enabler person or a disabler person, whether you have a diagnosis or not. You know, a person with Mensa could be easily as disabled as somebody who has autism or Down syndrome or in a wheelchair. It's a social issue, not a medical issue. And I think we need to re-explore how the church understands it as well as society understands the whole concept of disabilities in the 21st century. 90% of potential Abraham Lincolns, potential great leaders, great participants, great scientists are being aborted. A lot of the autism communities I belong to like to put out little pictures, and then one of them is it takes a person with autism to make a scientific breakthrough.
Nice.
You think about it, a lot of the historical scientific discoveries were made by people who are now believed to have had autism. I won't go through the list because we'd be here all day, but think about it. If race betterment is the goal of eugenics, and they're aborting the potential next Einstein, the next potential great discovery, the next great leader, the next great philosopher, or the next great theologian for us who are in the church world, then are we really bettering society by doing that? I would say no.
Excellent response.
I think we're hurting ourselves.
Excellent response.
And again, this goes back to how it changed the way we see humanity. We changed the way we see ourselves, our concepts of beauty, our concepts of intelligence. Binet, who came up with the IQ test, it was not meant to be used the way it is today. It was meant to be used as a tool to help people learn. And nowadays, it's used to discriminate and to create a stratification of people who, on the basis of perceived intelligence, on a test that is very subjective to start with. And those who belong to the right strata of society would do far better than somebody who even though may be incredibly intelligent, wouldn't do so well. And there's a lot of issues there. And you brought up, we talked about Buck versus Bell, which made it constitutional to have sterilization. But you know what? The truth is they didn't want to end with sterilization. They wanted to go the route of genocide, some of these guys. In Ontario, if it had not been for the mainstream church, chances are they would have had a mini genocide in Ontario, where I'm right now. Some of you might have heard of the 1917 movie Black Stork Baby, based on a real life story of Dr. Harry Hazelden. He convinced parents of children with disabilities not to take treatment that could save their lives. There are many articles, the New York Times, he said, this is from one of the articles dated June 28, 1918, New York Times. We gave ordinary care, but not the full benefit of scientific care, for had it lived, referring to the baby, it would have been unable to use its arms and legs. It would have been a burden to itself and parents. This is the message they give. We still hear today, is that people who are born different are going to be a burden. Therefore, let's get rid of them.
And all of this comes back to morality and what is right or wrong, which I'm going to get to with Paul in just a minute here. But of course, if it's legal to kill off an entire class of people, does that mean it's morally okay? Does that make it right? If it's legal to perform medical experiments against people's will, does that make it right? Dr. Bergman, the Nazis legally performed all kinds of horrific medical research. Could you give us some details on what was done?
Some of the things that were done, Joseph Mengele probably is the most well-known, or infamous, I should probably add, leader in the Nazi movement. And he was highly motivated, by his own words, by evolutionary biology. In fact, he had an MD and a PhD, and his thesis for both of these degrees was in evolutionary biology. And what he was trying to do by his infamous twin studies was to determine the influence of race versus environment. And, of course, that's done by twin studies. And some of the studies he did, he would, for example, inject Jews primarily with a variety of chemicals to try to determine how racial traits came about. He was trying to help those who had ambiguous racial traits become more Aryan. For example, blue eyes were seen as the ideal eye color, but many Germans had brown eyes. So how do you convert brown eyes to blue eyes? Well, he injected some of his subjects with dyes in their eyes to try to convert their eye color so they would be closer to the superior race. Well, as you imagine, this failed totally. It was an absolute fiasco. In fact, most of them, what happened is they became blind or their eyesight was severely compromised. Something else that he did, which really bothered me, was he smeared phosphorus on the Jews, then set the phosphorus on fire so he could get third-degree burns. Then he tried to come up with ways of dealing with this serious burn that he caused in the people that he injected this sulfur into, the phosphorus, into. And he was trying to come up with ways of being able to treat German prisoners or German soldiers that were injured in the war. And so why not experiment on actual prisoners or Germans that were injured in the war and use that information? But no, he wanted to utilize Jews and others to find out this information to help the German race, which was the superior race. And the ironic thing about this was that most of his experiments failed. They did not really help one learn much about medicine for many, many reasons. And another thing that he did, which I thought was pretty horrendous, was he would vacuum the subject's lungs until they ruptured, and then he would try to determine at what atmospheric pressure caused the rupturing. And he did that in order to help German pilots survive crashes. Another thing he did was determine how long it took to freeze someone, and so that to the point where they would die. So he put his subjects in cold water baths, measured their temperature, measured their blood pressure, and other vital signs, and then determined at what temperature and how long it took the patients, which he called them patients, to die. And these studies, many of them were published in scientific journals, and ironically, many of his fellow scientists felt very strongly that this is very important research. But today, if we look back at this, we can see some of these studies he did were absolutely idiotic, to say the least, like injecting blue dye in the eyes of his subjects.
Wow. Disturbing. Okay, we need to take a short break. We will be right back. This show is sponsored in part by Canada's first permanent creation museum in the heart of Alberta's dinosaur beds, the Big Valley Creation Science Museum at bvcsm.com. And by Genesis Park, where you can pre-order your own beautiful hard-covered copy of the Chronicles of Dinosauria, the history and mystery of dinosaurs and man. What does the Bible say about aliens? Is there life on other planets? What can science tell us about the possibility of aliens? Ian Juby gives answers to these and many more questions in this fascinating and highly disturbing subject. Looking analytically at the subject, complete with the testimonies of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. The answers will probably surprise you. In this 1.5-hour lecture, Ian shows that the alleged aliens are a problem and that Jesus is the solution. Order online today at Ian's bookstore. Welcome back to Genesis Week, where we are discussing the dark side of Darwin with my three guests. Dr. Bergman, I've heard people point to quotes from Hitler that are very Christian.
Yeah, there were many, many quotes that Hitler made. Several reasons for that. One is he was a politician, and politicians say what they have to get votes. And it's interesting that after he claimed he was a devout Christian, 20 minutes or an hour later, to his own men, he would say that he was going to destroy the Christian church.
There you have
it. But the first step was, and he brought out, you can't war against the whole world at once. We've got to worry about conquering the nations of Europe. Then we have to worry about the Jews. Then we have to worry about the Slavics. We have to worry about Russia. And later on in his plan was eventually to worry about the Christians. But not now, he said. We cannot have a war against pretty much everybody at once. Once we achieve our major military goals, then we can destroy Christianity. In the meantime, though, he's pretty clear in what he tried to do. Took the crosses out of churches, put swastikas in. Took the Bible out of churches, or actually rewrote it, and then put it back in. He changed it in such a way to where he pulled out the objectionable parts. Like, for example, where it says we should help the weak and help the poor, and we should be charitable, and we should forgive, and we should love our enemies. All those, of course, were very opposed to Nazi ideology. So he pulled those out, and then he put the Bible in the back in the churches. But he often, instead of putting the Bible back in, he put Mein Kampf in the churches so that people could read it. And by the way, he became quite rich from the selling of Mein Kampf because the people were in many ways strongly coerced to purchase the Mein Kampf book.
Strongly suggested, eh?
Yeah, strongly suggested. And I can mention, since I mentioned that a lot of people think that the doctors were coerced into doing these experiments. All the references I checked made it very clear that they were not coerced. They could freely, willingly opt out of doing these experiments, etc. In fact, some did. Said, do you want to be part of these? And some doctors said no. And his Nazi said, fine, then you can go back in the town.
Okay, now, Paul, in your book, you cover a really wide range of subjects related to social issues. One main focus of your book was the rise of postmodernism. Can you please define postmodernism?
Now, when you mention the word postmodern, some people may be thinking of architecture, but in this case, we're talking about worldviews, or more specifically, about secular religions. Now, to define postmodernism, as the name itself implies, it's a reaction to something, namely modernism. And so we'll need to do a bit of, cover a bit of Western cultural history to figure this out. Now, one of the basic issues when we're dealing with worldviews is the question, where is truth? Where do you get truth? And in the case of the Judeo-Christian worldview, truth comes from the Bible for the most part, because the Bible is. And during the Middle Ages, you had one first reaction to this dominant Christian worldview, and that was the Renaissance. The Renaissance was basically an attempt to develop an alternative. And one of the issues they faced was, where do we get truth? Well, their basic view was from Greek philosophy. And but as time went on, the Renaissance apple cart was overturned by science because the prestige of the Greek philosophers was being more and more criticized. Their understanding of the material world was being overturned, and so the prestige of the Greek philosophers was on the way down. So the people that were attempting to develop an alternative worldview to the Judeo-Christian worldview were finding that, okay, they'd bet on the wrong horse, basically. So from that point, then the Enlightenment comes in. And the Enlightenment, what they decided to do was to develop science and human reason as the source of truth. First stages of this, the modern view, you have, for example, people like Voltaire who accepted God as a first cause. So this was a very remote God. Mature stage, modernism has become purely materialistic. Just so humans basically live in a closed world. We live in a small box. And but so nowadays, convinced deists like people like Voltaire, well, there are very few of them, and you'd only find them in theological departments, basically, which leads us, of course, to Darwin and other well-known atheists such as Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins, and David Suzuki in Canada. So the Humanist Manifesto is an excellent example of of a modern credo. In other words, modern worldview. So the postmodern is a reaction to this modern, the modern view, the Enlightenment view. And one of the things the postmoderns believe is that they reject, first of all, Christianity, of course. They also reject this view that science is somehow a source of truth, because they view this as some sort of Western imperialism, it's Western arrogance, and actually they would probably consider it a perverted holdover from Christian views.
Now, one major point you brought out in your book, which I really liked, the connection between biological determinism and evolution. Now, for the sake of the viewers, biological determinism is the idea that your genes control what you do and what you are. Your biology determines who and what you are. Even the famous evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould saw the implications of combining postmodernism, biological determinism, and evolutionary thinking, and referred to it all as a, quote, social weapon, unquote, his words. I mean, really, that is what we're talking about here. This mindset is used as a weapon.
Yeah. Yeah, he actually coined the term, the expression Darwinian fundamentalists. Basically, this means that some people take evolution too far, and further down the line, because he was heavily involved in the whole debate in the late 70s about sociobiology, which is basically the idea that our genes determine who we are, and applying this to, for example, male-female relations and all kinds of other areas. And my impression, this is just my own impression, but I'm pretty sure there's a link between his participation in this debate and later on his development of what he called the NOMA theory. NOMA is basically the idea of non-overlapping magisteria. So basically what he said is that he recognized that science has its authority in the material world, but religion has some validity or authority in the area of morality. So basically, he was making a concession to religion that a lot of atheists would consider anathema. You know, it's not it's recognizing religion in any shape or form like this is out of the question. So Gould was taking a step that was a bit iffy, even from his own perspective. But he was forced to do this, in my view, because of the moral implications of evolution, which he'd done a lot of research on the eugenics movement and the IQ tests and all kinds of stuff like this. He'd done a lot of research on this, and and of course, being from a Jewish background and realizing what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust too, basically he would have agreed with what Doc was saying, that when you apply evolution to a whole civilization, to a whole society, well, the results can be pretty ugly. And it's just logical, because if you believe that humans are just leftovers from evolution, and they may be replaced. For example, you have people in the the artificial intelligence community movement, you could call it. So you have people in that movement who are telling us that man is not the summit of evolution. Man is just part of, it's a stepping stone. And the next step may be cyborgs or whatever, a mix between man and machine, computers, and so you have people doing experiments actually on themselves and implanting computer parts and computer to be in networking themselves, basically in computer networks. And in their view, man is just something, it's just a step in evolution. But there may be a next step. Man may find himself replaced by something better, of course.
Interesting, the attempts to improve humans. Dr. Bergman, you've taught genetics at the medical college, and as I've said many times on this show, evolutionary theory does not explain biology. In fact, evolutionary theory has hindered scientific progress and research, especially in biology and the medical field. How have you seen Darwinian evolution hinder medical research?
Well, it hinders medical research in many, many ways, and it's hard to know where to begin. But I guess some of my favorite and the most clear examples was Darwin, in one of his books, talked about organs that we today call vestigial, that either had less use or had no use whatsoever. And a good example, I just talked about this in my class the other day, was for years the tonsils were routinely removed. I had mine removed when I was about 5 years old, and I asked the doctor why. I was concerned. And so the doctor said, well, it's better to have them out when you're young than when you're older, so let's get them out and we'll take care of that. So I said, why do they have to be removed? There's nothing wrong with them. And he said, well, because they're vestigial, they have no function, therefore you get them out because all they do is cause problems. In fact, there's a joke in medical school. The purpose of the tonsils was to help the doctor pay for his new Mercedes.
Nice.
It's partially true, I suppose. But nowadays it's changed. We realize that tonsils have an important function, and instead of removing them, we treat them. In fact, I took surveys of my anatomy and physiology class the other day. About 75 students total I surveyed, and almost none of them had their tonsils removed. Well, my one class, out of 25 students, there are only 2 people that had their tonsils removed. So that just illustrates the fact that they are not removed now unless they absolutely have to be. If you have a swollen body part that's infected beyond salvation, you have to remove it. So occasionally they are removed, but by and large, medical practice has changed. And if you think about that, how many people have had tonsillectomies like me for no reason at all, and yet now we know they're important. Same thing is true with the appendix. The same thing is true with the thymus. The same thing is true with the spleen. The same thing is true with the pituitary. The same thing is true with the pineal gland. So we've had a lot of perfectly good organs taken out of our body for no reason at all. And now we realize that all of these cases can cause severe harm, and it does. Studies have shown, for example, people who have an appendectomy are more prone to certain diseases and less able to deal with certain conditions than if they had their appendix in there. The appendix is a very important function, and it should be left there. One of the 5 functions it has is it stores the good bacteria. So if you have diarrhea, you lose your bacteria in your colon, and as a result, the large intestine, and as a result, this needs to be replaced with the good bacteria, which now we realize is very, very important. And the appendix stores the good bacteria so that when you have diarrhea, you lose the bacteria coating of your colon, then this can be rapidly and effectively replaced by the good bacteria, which is stored in the appendix.
Right. And let us not forget the junk DNA. You've taught genetics at the college level. This is a classic case of evolutionary assumptions hindering proper scientific research.
It clearly did, and that discouraged doing research on this junk DNA, which it has no function. Now we realize it has many, many important functions, primarily regulation, but other reasons as well. But they estimate now about 80% of the genome has a function, and probably almost all of it does as we continue to do research on this area. And they used to think 98% of the genome is junk, is functionless. It has no function. So we've gone down from 98% useless to only 20% useless. And my guess is, in fact, already they're finding much of that 20% has some use, or at least did have some use, because, of course, we are accumulating mutations in the genome as a result of the fact that each generation has around 100 to 200 more new mutations which are introduced as a result of mutants like radiation and chemicals which cause mutations. And so we realize the mutational load now is increasing in every generation. So we are going backward, as I often stress. Evolution is true, but it's going the wrong way. We're not going upward, we're not ascending. And Darwin was correct. He said in his book, 1871 book, The Descent of Man. Well, he's right. We are descending. He meant the ascent of man, but he didn't say that. But his title actually turned out to be true, although at that time he didn't know it.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming on the show. I know the viewers appreciated your expertise. You can visit Joseph's Facebook page for Enable Faith Ministry at facebook.com/enablefaithministry. You can get a copy of Paul's excellent book, Flight from the Absolute, Volume 1, from Amazon.com. Volume 2 is due out this summer. And Dr. Bergman has several books related to the subject which are available on Amazon, such as The Dark Side of Darwin, exploring Darwin's troubled mind, as well as the highly disturbing and enlightening Hitler and the Darwinian Worldview, where he methodically documents how Darwinian evolution influenced the atrocities of the Holocaust. Thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Ian Juby, signing off for now. You can send in your comments and questions and feedback to us in a number of ways. Remember those words of warning and comfort from our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me." We'll see you next week. We need your support to keep this program on the air. Please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4.